In early November 1978, 26-year-old Vera Calloway stood in what had been her family's greenhouse and looked at what the storm had left her, which was not much. The greenhouse had taken the worst of it at about 2 in the morning, when the line of storms rolling off the Pacific found the ridge above the farm, and the wind turned from a hazard into a fact. The structure was glass and aging cedar, 60 feet long and 20 feet wide. A building her grandfather had put up in the 1940s that had been showing its age for years, and the storm took it apart all at once, faster than anyone expected. By the time Vera got her boots on and reached it, the roof was mostly gone. The cedar frame had collapsed along its eastern wall, and glass was everywhere in the beam of her flashlight, catching the light like something beautiful that had decided to be dangerous. The farm itself had survived reasonably well. The equipment shed was intact. The house had lost 2 sections of gutter and a porch screen. The orchard had some branch damage that would need attention before the ground froze. Her father, Howard Calloway, assessed all of this before sunrise and determined that the greenhouse was a loss. Catalog the damage, contact the insurance company, plan for a metal structure if they rebuilt at all. He was not wrong about any of that. He was describing the practical situation accurately and in the order of priority that a sensible person would use. Vera agreed with him about the equipment shed and the gutter and the orchard and the metal structure, and she began helping him move through the checklist with the methodical efficiency the morning after a farm emergency requires. What she did not agree about was the snails. The greenhouse had been home to a snail population for the better part of 3 years. The original snails had arrived with a shipment of potted herbs, the way snails always arrive, uninvited and invisible, until they are no longer either, and by the time Vera noticed the colony, it had established itself thoroughly enough in the humidity and warmth of the greenhouse that removing it would have been a significant undertaking. She had not removed it. She had begun observing it instead, which was a habit she had from her mother, who had been the kind of person who noticed things and wrote them down, and she had kept a notebook on the shelf beside the greenhouse door with entries about the snails' behavior and what they ate, and what they left behind on the glass surfaces where they traveled. The storm had scattered the snails across the debris field of the collapsed greenhouse, some dead, some injured, many simply displaced and slow in the November cold, waiting with the patience and curiosity of their kind for circumstances to improve. Vera counted what she could find through the course of that gray November morning, working carefully through the broken glass and splintered cedar while her father dealt with the insurance company on the phone in the house. She found approximately 5,000 snails in various conditions, which was fewer than she had estimated the colony to contain, but more than she had expected to survive the collapse. She collected them in the only containers she had available, which were a series of plastic storage bins she emptied from the equipment shed, and she transferred them to the barn, and she bedded them in damp newspaper and vegetable scraps, and told herself she would figure out the next step after she had slept. Her father came to the barn in the afternoon. He looked at the bins. He looked at Vera. He was a patient man who had spent 30 years farming in the Willamette Valley, and who had developed the considered opinion that most problems had a sensible solution if you approached them without sentiment. "What's the plan?" he said. It was not entirely a question. "I haven't fully worked it out," Vera said. "Vera, we lost the greenhouse. The snails lived in the greenhouse. The greenhouse is gone. I know that. So why are the snails in the barn?" She didn't answer immediately, because the answer she had was not the kind her father would find satisfying. She had saved them because they were there, and because she had been watching them for 3 years, and because discarding 5,000 living things felt wrong in a way she could not articulate as a business case. She said something that acknowledged the practical complexity without resolving it, and Howard, who recognized the expression on his daughter's face, said nothing further and went back to the house. By the time the neighbors heard about it, the story had the shape that makes a thing worth repeating. A young woman whose family farm had just taken storm damage had spent the morning saving snails instead of helping with the real work. A neighbor named Gerald Fitch mentioned it at the feed store, not unkindly. "The Calloway girl saved her snails," he said, shaking his head with a combination of affection and disbelief. The people at the counter laughed. The story moved from there, and by Christmas, Vera had heard 3 versions of it back, each one slightly more absurd than the last. She was not particularly bothered by this. She had grown up on this farm and she knew the county, and she knew that being laughed at for something unusual was simply the fee you paid for doing something unusual, and that the fee was not very high. What she was thinking about, through the weeks of November when she was also dealing with insurance claims and orchard cleanup and the ordinary work of a farm in late autumn, was what she had been writing in the notebook beside the greenhouse door. Let me explain what Vera had been noticing. In 3 years of watching the snail colony, she had filled 2 notebooks with observations that were, at first, simply the records of someone paying attention to something unfamiliar. She had noted what they ate and in what quantities, how they moved in response to temperature and humidity changes. But she had also noted, with increasing specificity, what they left behind on the glass surfaces where they traveled. A snail leaves a trail. Every gardener knows this, and most view it as a minor nuisance. Vera had begun, sometime in her 2nd year, to look at the trails themselves rather than simply using them as a navigational map. She noticed that the glass surfaces where the snails had traveled frequently were different from the surfaces where they hadn't, not obviously, not dramatically, but in the way that a surface looks when something has been cleaning it from the inside. She had collected the mucin, which was the word she found in a library book about mollusk biology, in small amounts, and experimented with it on her own hands, which were chapped and cracked from farm work, and she noticed that the areas she treated were healing differently from the areas she did not. This was not scientific. She had not run a controlled study or done anything that a researcher would recognize as methodology. She had simply been paying attention to something over time and had noticed a pattern, and the pattern was interesting enough that she had continued collecting what information she could. In the library in Eugene, she had found 2 things. The first was a summary of research from a French journal describing the mucin secretion of the common garden snail as containing a complex mixture of compounds including glycoproteins, hyaluronic acid, and glycolic acid, with moisturizing, regenerative, and barrier function properties in dermal tissue. It had been published in 1973, 5 years before Vera stood in the ruins of her greenhouse counting snails in the cold. The second was a brief mention in a cosmetics industry trade newsletter from the early 1970s, noting that European formulators had begun experimenting with snail secretion as a raw ingredient in high-end skincare preparations, and that early consumer response had been enthusiastic, though the supply chain for the ingredient was essentially non-existent outside of a handful of small operations in France and Chile. She read that second piece 3 times. Then she photocopied it and put it in her notebook. She drove home and looked at the bins of snails in the barn and thought about what she had just read and what she had been writing in 2 notebooks for 3 years and what those things might mean in combination. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever found yourself at the intersection of something you have been quietly learning and something the world has been quietly looking for, and felt the particular sensation of those 2 things becoming, in the same moment, part of the same story? That was where Vera Calloway stood in November of 1978, in a barn in Oregon with 5,000 snails in plastic bins and a library photocopy in her notebook, working out what to do next. What she did next was build an enclosure. She used salvaged lumber from the destroyed greenhouse frame and built a series of connected outdoor pens on the south-facing slope below the barn, protected from the worst of the winter wind by the barn wall and by a windbreak of Douglas fir along the ridge. She covered the pens with fine mesh, bedded them with the same leaf litter and damp soil the snails had been moving through in the greenhouse, and transferred the colony from the plastic bins to the new enclosure over the course of a week. The enclosure was ugly and obviously improvised. Gerald Fitch drove past and saw it, and the story went back to the feed store. The Calloway girl had not just saved her snails, she was building something to put them in. This second chapter was funnier than the first, which Vera expected and accepted. Howard walked down to look at the enclosure on a Sunday morning in December. He was the kind of man who could look at a piece of work and tell you whether it was built to last, and he looked at this one for a while. "It'll hold through winter," he said finally, which was not encouragement exactly, but was the closest he was likely to get. He looked at her for a moment with the expression he wore when he was working out whether a thing was worth arguing about. He had spent 30 years as a practical farmer, and he valued practicality, but he had also raised this daughter, and he understood something about the specific quality of her attention when it was fixed on something. He did not say anything else about the snails, and he went back to the house. Through the winter months, Vera developed her harvesting process. The mucin that snails produce is not extracted or milked or pressed. The snails produce it when they move, coating the surfaces they travel across with a thin, continuous layer of secretion that serves as their locomotion mechanism and as a protective barrier against abrasion. The challenge was not getting the snails to produce it, they produced it continuously, as long as they were healthy and active, but collecting it without harming them and in sufficient quantity to be useful. She experimented through December and January, trying different collection surfaces and timing, studying what conditions produce the most active movement. She found that the snails were most active at dawn and at dusk, moving most freely in warm, humid conditions with a light mist on the collection surfaces. She built a simple misting system from a garden hose fitting and an adapted irrigation controller timer, set it to run at 5 in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon, and began collecting the secretion from the mesh surfaces using a rubber scraper and transferring it to small glass jars, sealed and labeled with the date and conditions. She kept records. She always kept records. By the spring of 1979, she had a process that was reproducible and that produced a consistent output without visibly stressing the colony. The snails were healthy and the population was growing, which meant she had more animals producing more secretion than when she had started. She had 37 small glass jars on the shelf in the barn, each labeled in her handwriting, each representing what she had collected in a single session over 5 months of winter and early spring work. She had also, by then, run enough informal tests on her own skin to be confident that what she had read in the French journal research was not an anomaly. The compounds in the secretion were doing something. The skin on her hands, which had been perpetually cracked and rough from farm work for as long as she could remember, was different. Not dramatically, not overnight, but different in the way that something is different when the underlying condition has genuinely changed rather than been temporarily treated. She was not a cosmetics chemist. She could not analyze what she was applying, but she had been observing her own hands the way she observed everything, carefully and over time, and the pattern was real. She wrote up what she had 4 pages of careful, dated notes in the form she used for everything, and sent a copy to the Agricultural Extension Office in Eugene, because the Extension Office was the institution she had always used when she needed a professional opinion. They sent back a polite letter saying the topic fell outside their usual scope, but that the observations were interesting and suggesting she might consider contacting a university research program. She filed the letter and kept working. The private doubt came in the second winter, which was the winter of 1979, going into 1980, when the rain was heavier than usual, and the drainage in the lower section of the enclosure was inadequate, and she lost part of the population to flooding before she could respond. Standing in the mud of the enclosure at 2 in the morning with a flashlight and a salvaged piece of drainage pipe and the sound of the rain on the mesh overhead, she was aware, with the quiet, patient clarity that difficult moments sometimes produce, of everything the situation looked like from the outside. She was a 27-year-old woman on a farm in Oregon, standing in a flooding snail pen at 2 in the morning, having spent the past year filling glass jars with snail secretion and sending 4-page handwritten notes to extension offices that sent polite letters back suggesting she contact someone else. She finished rerouting the drainage. She lost fewer animals than she had feared. She went back to bed at 4:30 and got up at 6 and went back to work. That was all there was to do, and she knew it, which is a certain kind of knowledge that requires you to have already decided what you are doing and why before the difficult moment arrives, so that the difficult moment does not require you to make the decision again. The buyer arrived in August of 1980 through a series of events that Vera had not arranged and could not have planned. His name was Mr. Haverford, and he worked for a regional natural ingredients supplier based in Portland that sourced specialty agricultural products for the cosmetics and personal care industry. He was in the Willamette Valley on a routine sourcing trip, visiting lavender farms and herb growers and a small bee operation that supplied raw beeswax, and he had stopped at the Calloway farm because someone at the lavender operation had mentioned that the Calloway girl was doing something unusual with snails, and that if you were in the business of unusual ingredients, it might be worth a look. He was a man accustomed to looking at things skeptically and to arriving at farms with expectations that the reality rarely met, and he arrived at the Calloway farm with those expectations intact. He stood outside the enclosure in the August morning with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and he looked at the structure and the population visible through the mesh and at the clean, organized state of the operation with the expression of a man who had revised his expectations upward slightly but was not yet ready to say so. Vera walked him through it. She showed him the collection process, the misting system, the glass jars in the barn, the records she kept. She showed him the 4 pages she had sent to the extension office and the additional 12 pages of documentation she had developed in the 2 years since. She handed him a jar of secretion and let him look at it. He asked her questions for almost 2 hours. Some of them were technical, and some were practical, and some were clearly designed to test whether she knew what she was talking about, and she answered all of them from the notes and from 2 years of direct experience with the material. And at some point in the middle of the 2nd hour, something shifted in the quality of his attention, the slight physical reorganization that happens when a skeptical person stops performing skepticism and starts actually listening. "How much are you producing?" he asked. She told him the monthly yield in grams, which was not large by any measure he would have been accustomed to working with, but which was consistent and which came with 2 years of quality documentation behind it. He was quiet for a moment. "There's a formulator in San Francisco I need to talk to," he said, "and a sourcing team in New York. I'd like to be able to call them this week." He looked at the jars on the shelf. "Can I take a sample?" "Yes," Vera said, "if we establish terms first." He looked at her. She was 28 years old and she was a farmer, and she was wearing work clothes with mud on the knee, and he had not expected that sentence from her. "Terms," he said. "Terms," she said. "I'll give you a sample if we agree in writing that the sample is to be used for evaluation only, that proprietary information about my process stays confidential, and that any commercial arrangement goes through me directly." Haverford studied her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had come to look at a farm curiosity. He was now standing in front of someone who understood what she had. He agreed to the terms. She typed them on her father's electric typewriter that evening, and they signed them the next morning, and she gave him 2 jars to take back to Portland. She waited 3 weeks. Then Haverford called, and behind him, eventually, others called. Let me tell you how it moved, because the movement of it was not what anyone in the county would have predicted in 1978, when the story was about a young woman saving snails from a destroyed greenhouse. The San Francisco formulator who received the sample was a woman named Diaz, who had been watching the European snail mucin research for several years and who had been unable to find a consistent domestic source, and when she analyzed what Haverford sent her, she called him within a week. The sourcing team in New York had their own contacts, and within 2 months of Haverford's visit to the farm, Vera had received inquiries from 4 companies she had never heard of and 1 company that she had, a mid-sized personal care brand whose products she had seen on the shelves of the drugstore in Eugene. She did not respond to any of these inquiries immediately. She responded to each one on her own timeline, which was deliberate, and she responded with a document she had prepared that described her operation, her production capacity, her quality standards, and her terms of engagement. The terms of engagement were specific. She would supply what she could supply. She would not compromise the health of the colony for volume. She would not share her process documentation with any buyer, and she would set the price. Every company that made an inquiry ultimately accepted these terms. Not immediately, and not without attempting to negotiate, and not without the particular friction that happens when a company that is accustomed to setting the terms of its supplier relationships encounters a supplier who has already set hers. But they accepted them because the alternative was no supply at all, and no supply at all was the situation they were already in before they called her. Howard Calloway understood what was happening by the spring of 1981, when the second check arrived and was larger than the first. He stood in the kitchen with the check in his hand for a moment, looking at it. "The snails," he said. "The snails," Vera said. He set it on the counter and looked at it for another moment. He was not a man who made a large production of changing his mind, but he had the honesty of a person who keeps an accurate account of what he gets right and what he gets wrong. "I thought you'd lost perspective," he said. "I know," she said. He picked up the check and handed it to her. He said nothing else about the snails, which was his way of saying what he needed to say. Gerald Fitch came by the farm in the summer of that year, stopping as he sometimes did to look at the operation he had been describing at the feed store for the better part of 3 years. He stood outside the enclosure, which had been expanded twice since its first construction and now occupied a significant section of the south-facing slope below the barn, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. It was, by then, a different thing from what he had been describing, a clean, well-maintained, methodically run operation that looked nothing like a rescue project, and everything like a business that knew what it was doing. "Vera," he said finally, "I have to tell you that I talked about this at the feed store a good number of times, and I made it sound pretty foolish." "I know," she said. "I heard the versions." He looked at the enclosure. "Well," he said. He turned his hat in his hands in the way men do when they have said the thing they came to say and are not sure what follows it. "I was wrong about it." Vera nodded. She appreciated the directness of this, and she felt no need to make more of it than it was. Gerald was not a bad man, and he had not been cruel. He had laughed at something that looked laughable, which is what people do, and she had done what she was going to do, which is also what people do. And here they both were. In the years that followed, the Calloway farm settled into what it had become, a specialty operation that produced one thing in small quantities and sold it at prices that would have struck a 1,978 feed store conversation as science fiction. Vera hired a part-time assistant by 1983, a local woman named Margaret, who learned the morning and evening collection routine and became, over time, a genuinely skilled observer of the colony. The snail population grew with the enclosure, which grew with demand, which Vera managed by keeping demand in a permanent state of mild frustration, because she had understood from Haverford's visit that scarcity was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be maintained. She never sold the process documentation. She never allowed buyers to visit the operation beyond a brief initial meeting. She never entered an exclusive arrangement with any single company. These were not accidents or oversights. They were the terms, and the terms were the reason the operation worked the way it did, because an ingredient with a single documented source that kept its methods proprietary and its supply constrained was something the cosmetics industry could not simply replicate or replace. And Vera had understood this in the barn in November of 1978, with a library photocopy in her notebook and 5,000 snails in plastic bins, and she had never had reason to change her understanding. Her mother had taught her to pay attention. Her grandfather had left her a greenhouse. A storm had destroyed it. She had gone out the morning after and counted what was alive. The rest had followed from that.